This episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by ServiceNow. ServiceNow is changing the way people work. With a service orientation towards the activities, tasks, and processes that make up day-to-day work life, ServiceNow helps the modern enterprise operate faster and be more scalable than ever before. To learn more about the enterprise cloud built to manage everything as a service, please visit www.servicenow.com. And now, on to the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, where you are, and welcome to another episode of the Cloudcast. For those that have forgotten at this point who the heck this is Aaron. I haven't been on the show in, gosh, I don't know, a month?
6 weeks, yeah.
Month and a half, and then like maybe one show before that. So I have to, apologize to everyone before we even get started. It is good to be back. I will say moving and, summer and lots of things like that has unfortunately taken my time away from the podcast for a little bit, but back, and I should quit bragging on our streak we had earlier this week because that obviously jinxed us, right, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. We went about 10 or 11 weeks in a row, and then, of course, we got back to normal things. So, hey, real quick before we get into our guests tonight, because it's going to be a fun show, we should give folks a quick update on what we're doing with the serverless stuff. So name and some of those things and timing and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So working on a very, very early August rollout. Serverless cast is coming. We considered calling it the Jeff cast, but we kind of figured that would only be funny for about a month. So we're not super creative with the name sometimes. So that's the name we're going with for now. And domains are registered, infrastructure is being built. We're building another massive studio and looking for, like I said, beginning of August rollout.
Yep. Yeah. So we should have all that stuff done. We'll definitely publish it out through this channel. And we've got, which is really nice, we have a huge backlog of guests and show topics and stuff to have sort of right away. So we'll be doing that. And then I'm actually doing I'm going to be a guest on the Data Knots podcast next week with Ethan and Chris Wall, and we're going to kind of do a little preview and talk about serverless stuff as well. So if you want to get a little preview, the Data Knots podcast is really, really good for lots of topics. They just happen to be talking about serverless next week. So
very nice.
Enough about that. Why don't we get to tonight's guest? Tonight's going to be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So wanted to, we've been talking about containers a good bit on this show, but one of the big things is we talk about the operational side here and there, but we really wanted to focus on one area specifically, and that being container security. In order to do that, we'd like to welcome to the show Randy Kilmon, VP of Engineering at Black Duck Software. How you doing tonight, Randy?
I'm great, thanks. Hey, guys.
Hey.
So you wanted to, I really wanted to kind of first start off with a little bit about your background, but also specifically the area of focus of Black Duck Software, because it's really kind of fascinating and really unique. So if you don't mind, give everyone a little background out there.
Sure. I've been at Black Duck for a little over 11 years now, so kind of a long timer. The company's been around, I guess, 12 or 13 years at this point. It got a start really around open source licensing compliance. That was the original product offering, and it was aimed at big companies that wanted to mitigate their risk of shipping GPL code or something like that. And then over the years, we added additional capabilities, mostly in the security space, as well as operational risk, what we call operational risk, which is essentially reporting on the overall health of open source components and open source projects, with regard to how many committers there are, and if it's going up or down, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I know I've been familiar with Black Duck in the past. Some of the companies that I'd worked with previously, we'd gone through some M&A stuff, and we'd use the Black Duck software to make sure that, like you said, we weren't shipping any software that had unknown libraries and stuff that we may have put in there that we were, license violating. It also gave us a really good inventory of what we were doing. You've obviously been there for, like you said, for most of the life of the company. How's it evolved? I guess not just the company, but more importantly, like why has it evolved? What have been the big open source trends that have forced you to get into security, now getting into container security? What's driving kind of all the innovation around what you guys are working on?
I guess it's really most attributed to, just the explosion of open source in general. So when I first arrived at Black Duck, I'd been working in the Java space and for years, really. So open source was not news to me, but our knowledge base at that time when I joined, I think we had 50,000 open source components, maybe not even that many, including different versions of things. And we thought that was pretty good and pretty big. And when customers would scan, they might find a few pieces of open source here and there, but it wasn't like it is today, where we have about 1.7 million components in the KB, roughly, plus hundreds of versions of each of those. And the large majorities of code bases today are basically made up of open source. So there's been real growth in terms of the use of open source, as well as a growth in the production of open source.
Right.
And so I think that basically has been driving our business forward as well.
And so that's fantastic. And it's interesting to see how that model has grown over time and how you have been able to kind of follow the open source movement. And that's fantastic. But then we also have the kind of the next movement, if you will, and that being containers. And then, of course, container security is what we're going to talk about here. And what makes the reality, if you will, of container security? What are the areas people should be thinking about or focusing their attention on when it comes specifically to containers and securing them?
Well, certainly there's a number of things that you want to consider. One of the things that Black Duck helps people manage, of course, is basically just the contents of the container. So what are the components that you're using in the container? It's not really that different from traditional deployment models, really, from our perspective, because it's our belief that you should practice good hygiene on your open source, whether it's in a container or not. But understanding what's in there and what the risks are associated with those components is certainly very important. And so that would be the main thing: understand what's in there and understand what may be vulnerable. Understand where you are in terms of the version lifecycle of those components, and then make sure that you have taken all the measures you need to patch things up and make sure that you're in good shape. So that's probably the most important one. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other things that you want to be aware of, like more sort of in runtime when the container or the image is deployed and run. You want to do things like monitoring the network traffic over that cluster to make sure that things are communicating as they should be, et cetera.
Yeah. Where's so there's kind of a lot of moving pieces, especially as we start getting into sort of the things that people are putting into containers. They tend to be not. It's kind of an interesting transition, because if you go into like Docker Hub or the big registries, there's still some existing applications that are highly used, MySQL and Nginx and some well-known applications. But more and more we're seeing applications that are frequently updated, have multiple dependencies. Some of it lives in a registry. You've got people now trying to do key value management, key stores and stuff. Like where does Black Duck kind of technology fit in terms of keeping looking at things from a security perspective? Is it scanning registries? Is it part of a kind of a Jenkins CI/CD tool chain? Is it part of sort of the normal operational framework of doing security monitoring? Where's all the places that it's doing scanning and trying to help customers out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the short answer is yes to pretty much all of those. People, use our products to scan their registries. They use them in CI and they use the notifications once things are deployed. So we kind of feel that it's most efficient to move the scanning as far left in the process as you can. So
Okay.
Earlier in the process, therefore, sort of in the even in the selection would be a good time to start, checking things out. But in terms of scanning, certainly continuous integration is the easiest place to plug us in, and the place that really makes the most sense.
Yeah. And are you plugging in sort of in a similar way to something like Sonar, or what's the, like, if I'm a developer, where would you expect to sort of interact with the Black Duck technology, or start getting sort of feedback from it, versus if I'm in operations or test or something? Like, where are the different groups seeing these vulnerabilities? Where are they seeing the problems? You talk about shifting it left. Like, give me the day in the life of those two different teams.
Sure. So if you're a developer, you might get your first notification of a problem when you run a Gradle build in your Eclipse workspace, right, through the Gradle integration that we have. That could tell you right off the bat that maybe that jar file, for example, has a known vulnerability.
Okay.
Or it may happen when you commit your code and the Jenkins build runs and the scan is run and the policies are applied. That for some other reason, you're out of compliance, right? It might be a vulnerability. It might be, there's a new version that came out that pushed you over the limit of how far back you're supposed to be, or it could be a licensing issue. So those are kind of the three main buckets that you might expect to, get notified about from our products. And so, sort of that's it on the dev side, right? And then you may, sometimes it's an integration to Jira, right? The build runs, it fails, it reports out that this or that component was found and had this issue. It could create a Jira ticket that gets assigned to you, something along those lines.
Okay, so ultimately, you've got to fit everywhere in that pipeline,
right?
Yeah,
right, and so that's super interesting, because that's I guess you could say the ideal scenarios. But I'm also fascinated too by the flip side of that. Okay, what are the use cases where folks are, they integrate this and they kind of, there's, I guess you could call them, learning mistakes, right? What are the things when people put this in and they kind of go, oops, we definitely should have done this sooner? Or what are the most common areas that you can kind of make a difference immediately and that kind of just jumps out to most average users?
Yeah, that moment, the oops moment, usually comes when we engage in the sales process, right? So, over the last decade or so, I've noticed that it's pretty universal that when people first engage with us and they do a proof of concept, we run scans over some of their sample code that they provide, and sometimes it's, we're not using that, and sure enough, it turns out, well, you are using that. It's right here. So that happens in almost every engagement. So there's always something that you can learn about your code by scanning.
Okay. Well, and that goes back to so we were reading through the Black Duck, the open source security survey, and we'll put a link in the show notes to it. But some really interesting things jumped out at us of, like you were saying, 30% of all commercial software has open source software in there somewhere. And the average age of vulnerabilities at the time of the scanning, it was like 1,800, 1,900 days, something just really, really crazy like that.
Yeah, years.
Right. And that just blew my mind to hear that number in particular. So this isn't like, it's, day 1, day 0, this is day 1,800. And what do you think, what are your thoughts around why does something like that go on for that long? Is this just things that just classically get left behind and never get addressed, and why?
Yeah, that's interesting. So some of it is that people are just not, on top of it. But I think another kind of to answer your original question about, so that I described the dev side. On the ops side, however, one of the kind of classic, I guess, mistakes that we see is people who check things, once when they pull down the jar file, they say, okay, we're using version 1.2.3 and it looks like it's got no vulnerabilities. Great, we're going to put it in the stack. And then they ship it and they forget about it. And so much of this is about the way the vulnerability picture changes over time, right? So just because something is considered okay today doesn't mean it's going to be okay in 6 months, right? So some of it is just probably a buildup of vulnerabilities that occur after, post deployment and post selection, and probably some of it is also, just kind of the tax on the team to try to keep up with all that stuff.
Yeah.
And therefore, like the use of containers in a lot of these scenarios where the attack surface or the number of objects just increases exponentially, you can see how things like that would become certainly more beneficial over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And containers are sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because it's so easy to spin them up and it's so easy to have a problem. But then again, it's also quite easy to fix it once you discover it. So there's good news and bad news there.
Yeah, I think I heard, I was listening to something else here recently, and I think somebody sort of described it as like, there's times when you don't care if your servers are basically on fire as long as it's still making the company money or sort of doing its job. So, Aaron, it's sort of like your analogy we had this weekend where you packed stuff away for 6 weeks and you kind of forgot about it and you forgot where it was and you didn't care about it anymore. And, you don't think about it. But yeah, the 1800 days still seems crazy. Those must be sort of lower end vulnerabilities. I can't imagine those are like Heartbleed and stuff like that, or do you see the stuff like that where the super priority one stuff drags out that long?
I think even some high priority ones do drag out longer than they should, but I think it's likely that those are lower priority ones that are going for that long.
Yeah.
But I mean, Heartbleed is another great example, right? So how long was that vulnerability in the component before somebody just discovered it, right? So
right. Hey, I got a question about, it goes back to this sort of the separation of dev and ops, depending on how people are organized. Like, how do you see, you guys obviously got into scanning and security before containers kind of became this buzz thing. Do you see a difference in how people kind of actively manage and try and secure containers versus they do the hosts they run on themselves? Are you seeing any kind of just behaviors or best practices that, say that those things are staying in sync or they're getting kind of away from each other?
Actually, I think the whole move towards containers has probably helped to heighten the awareness on both of those levels, both, what are you using, what's in those containers? That was one of the first questions that people started asking. And then, as part of that process, I think people are getting swept up in making sure that, now I'm running all these containers on a host. I got to make sure that that's secure too. Why bother securing the containers if the host is not secure? So I think it's been beneficial overall that more focus on security has come to light due to containers.
Yeah.
Well, and along those lines, what has been your view of container repositories, right? Because we've heard certainly both good and bad around them, and is that something where you feel like repositories as a source could lead to something like the 1800-day vulnerabilities and some of these other things? Or is that actually the centralization of those containers makes it much easier and more advantageous long term?
I think in the long term, clearly it will be advantageous to have things centralized and managed and reported out and maintained, right? So I think it's trending in that direction.
Yeah. I'll ask you sort of one last question because I know it's sort of late, and so we've got a number of listeners, who are going through different paths with containers, and we hear all sorts of numbers thrown around. How much people are using containers, how much is in production, and there's this big debate in the industry. Do you just kind of run containers natively with one of these schedulers, or do you use one of these platform as a service types of things like a Cloud Foundry or OpenShift? Or you guys seen any trends one way or the other as to how people are running their containers, and then more importantly any guidance for them about security one way or the other that might influence how they decide to run their containers?
So I don't see any real pattern developing. As you point out, I've got people running it with Puppet and Chef. I've got people running it, in Docker Cloud. I've got people running it in Kubernetes and Mesos, and OpenShift and all kinds of things. So I don't think there's been a real consolidation yet around any particular technology. It's actually interesting. I feel it's quite fluid still at this point. Although in the last few months, I have seen a little more of our customers asking and talking about OpenShift. So maybe things are picking up on that side a little bit. And just in terms of advice, I mean, for speaking of OpenShift, actually, if you run OpenShift on Atomic Host, Black Duck has a great integration there to help manage the container security, sort of at the platform level, really at the host level. So it's a nice integration and one that people should probably check out if they get the chance.
Interesting. Okay. Well, good. Well, listen. Hey, sort of last word. I'll sort of let you have the last word. Any guidance for people in terms of just security best practices are always security in depth and can keep things up to date. But anything specific around containers you kind of wish you could get out to the masses and sort of make sure everybody was doing before you walk into that next customer meeting.
I guess one of the interesting things about containers is really how it blends together, the whole stack from top to bottom in ways that people aren't used to. So, if you're a Java developer or UI developer, you're kind of used to working in your, in your layer there. When things get into the container, well, now everything is right there. The piece that the ops guy used to manage for you, you might have to be selecting the operating system that you want to use, right? Or, just I guess the thing that's really been an eye opener for me is how much open source there is out there, and how many different pieces people use, and how many vulnerabilities there are. So, being able to find a solution that helps you manage all that stuff from top to bottom is really critical. So, including the Linux pieces, the kernel, the distros, the middle tier, and the UI parts. So, just a lot more mixed together now, I guess.
Yeah, we've seen that quite a bit.
Well, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So, what's Randy? What's the best way if people want to kind of follow up? Maybe ask you some questions, or best place, aside from the Black Duck webpage, where they can find your team, they can ask questions, they might run into you guys at a meetup or something like that.
Sure. I'm going to be at Black Hat at the beginning of August. We usually go to DockerCon. I was at DockerCon. You can feel free to email me if anybody has any questions. Please reach out. It's rkilmon at blackducksoftware.com. And otherwise, we'll see you out there. Cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the insight tonight. I know we've got a lot of folks who are going down this journey and are wanting to make sure they stay secure and don't blow up their company assets. So thank you very much for that. Aaron, you want to take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, on behalf of both Brian and myself, thank you for listening this week, and hopefully we'll both be back next week. We'll see.
Thanks a lot, guys. It was great talking to you.
Thanks,
All right,
Randy.
thank you, Randy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.